welcome back. Thanks to you viewers, I get a lot of questions each day, and I try to answer those questions as best I can and as swiftly as I can. And sometimes those questions are the material for a subject that I present here online. Now, thanks to Dave G., he asked, is it true that what I've heard that it takes 500 rounds through a pistol before it settles down, before it's ready? Well, that's a fairly common assertion that I've seen written and presented in many blog sites. And you know how the blog sites are, if you've ever been on one or seen them. Everybody receives a certain status. They might get some up in the corner. There's some sort of maybe military rank. You start out as a PFC, and then you become a general and so forth. You get all these ranks in between according to how many times you've answered questions or how many years you've been online and things like that. And they can have all kinds of stuff in their status column, that whatever they did in life, they can put it up there, and all the guns that they've ever owned and all that stuff. And there's no declaration form to fill out, and you don't have to appear before any jury or any committee or anything like that to prove your status. You can just simply claim whatever you want to claim, and it's laid out there bare for everybody to believe or disbelieve. And unfortunately, in this day and age of, what we have a hyper media where everything is, you don't have to wait for anything anymore. You can just immediately go online and present it. So in this particular day of, hyper media activity, everybody's out there and everybody is making all sorts of assertions and all sorts of claims. Back in the 80s, Heather Locklear was in a shampoo commercial, and she said, if you tell two friends, and they'll tell two friends, and they'll tell two friends, and so on and so on, and the TV screen kept dividing into all these faces of Heather Locklear as it multiplied. And that's the way basically rumors go about, and that's the way claims go about online. And it happens much, much faster than that, because when somebody pronounces something online, in one of these blogs, there are perhaps hundreds, maybe even thousands of people who are going to be viewing that over the course of a month or two. And they'll tell two friends, and so on and so forth. Well, the idea that it takes 500 rounds for a gun to settle in is essentially it fails its own scrutiny. I like to always look at a premise according to how does it even stand against its own claims. If I say that you need to take a gun and fire it 500 times before it settles in, what is it exactly that I'm claiming? That it can't fire 500 rounds before it can fire the 501st? Was there something defective about the first 500? What is exactly was the assertion here? And why 500? Where did that come from? Does anybody have any material, substantial, empirical, rational reason behind 500 rounds and what occurs at 501 or 510? In a court of law, an attorney will say, well, if a fire is good after 500, maybe it was firing good after 495. Yeah. Well, maybe even 400. Yeah. Well, maybe after 300. Well, maybe. And then the person on the stand gets nervous because he sees where that's going. Things are deteriorating very quickly. So if I hear somebody say that a gun takes 500 rounds before it settles in, I'm going to ask them, well, was it firing good at 499 and so forth? You can't fire a gun 500 times unless it did exactly what the manufacturer asserted it was going to do on the first round, is to fire. If you fired it the first magazine full and it had no problems, and you stuck another magazine in it and fired for another magazine full and had no problems, why do you need to fire 500 rounds for it to do what it did the first two magazines full? Now, if it didn't do what it was supposed to do, what the manufacturer claimed that it was supposed to do with the first two magazines, you pick up the phone and you call the manufacturer and you resolve the issue with the service department. But that has nothing to do with whether or not the firearm functions the way it's supposed to. Let's go into what the assertions oftentimes claim, is that the gun becomes maybe more accurate as time goes on. Well, my friends, the accuracy of a firearm has absolutely nothing to do with the features that make it into a repeating firearm. In other words, once it's gone through this process of cycling and going into battery and loading chambering around and loading, I simply fire it. It's a single-shot weapon until the action cycles by itself. It functions no differently than a single-shot firearm. The process of cycling is simply its repeat fire mechanism. That's what defines it as a repeater. It has absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with whether or not the barrel points downrange. It has nothing to do with whether or not the sights are aligned. And if it's functioning, if I pull it out of my holster and I fire a magazine full and the slide came back and forth and it fired every single time, what's changing after 500 rounds? I'm pulling it out of the holster and firing it, and it's cycling every time. Nothing has changed. It's a bogus assertion. The other claim is that somehow or another it becomes smoother. Well, that I will say, yeah. The slide will feel more burnished after it's cycled the first few times. It certainly is not going to take 500 times, and it doesn't take any ammunition in order to do that. The slide cycling doesn't require ammo. The slide cycling can be done simply manually like that, manipulating it a few times until it feels nice and smooth. When I bought this gun, I could feel a slight friction in the slide and the lower frame. I just simply drew it back and forth a few times like that, and maybe a couple of dozen times, and it smoothed out. That was the end of it. I don't have to fire 500 rounds in order to accomplish that mission. And as far as the trigger goes, the trigger doesn't change. If, heaven forbid, the trigger should keep on whittling down, because pretty soon you wouldn't have a trigger. So the trigger does not change, my friends. As to a revolver, depending on whether it's a Smith & Wesson or a Colt or a Ruger or whomever, it may be a pawl or a hand, and these may be ratchets or the stars or whatever, and those two will, after the first few pulls of a trigger, those will feel a little bit slipperier than they did when you first picked it out of the box. But don't think that you're the first human hand that ever touched this gun when you bought it. This gun has been handled by human hands many times before you saw it, and that's what it goes through during the entire production process and manufacturing process, is that for every part that's fitted, the interaction of those parts is checked, and it's everything is verified that those parts are interacting correctly. And as the parts are built upon one another and they become more and more, each time something's added, those parts are checked and function is assured all the way through the system until it becomes a final assembled gun, fitted, and then it goes to the test proof range, where it goes into a box and is fired a number of times and with overloads to assure that it's not only going to function correctly, and they cycle the gun the way that it's meant to be cycled, so that if it's a auto-loading pistol, a magazine is inserted and boom, 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 it's fired, whether it's a rifle or a shotgun or whatever. It goes through that process to assure that it's going to be functioning when you receive it. So don't dismay when you buy a brand new gun that somehow you have to buy 500 rounds and a case of ammo in order to go to the range and then bore everybody as you stand there and fire 500 rounds. Because when you get to the 501st, it's going to be doing exactly the same thing that it did when you fired the first round. It's going to fire the cartridge. That's what you bought it for, and that's what it's going to do. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. God bless.